One issue that has been prominent throughout all of history is the effect of government on their people. And this issue is explored in the two extracts, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi and the film The Post by Liz Hanna. And so my global issue is about specifically the oppressive regimes causing negative effects on people's freedom. And this issue is further explored in the two works that I mentioned. And through the use of visual and textual techniques, the graphic novel Persepolis and the film The Post highlight the global issue of repressive regimes causing negative effects on freedom. So to start off, I'd like to start by analyzing Persepolis. So Persepolis takes place during the early 1970s in the capital of Iran, which is Tehran. And the graphic novel is a memoir by Marjane Satrapi. So it recounts her experiences in Iran during that time period. That's important to note because this is basically a primary source of information. And so to start off with the actual analysis of the extract, in panel 1, which is the leftmost panel, we see a government official talking to an interviewer, and he describes the kind of culture of Iran and mentions that it is decadent. And so the word decadent refers to a cultural decline, showing how the government is not in agreement with the citizens' idea of what Iran's culture should be. And this kind of shows how the government has an apathetic kind of mindset towards the citizens, because they don't necessarily show concern for the people's ideologies and more so want to enforce their own ideologies, such as the true path of Islam, which is also mentioned in panel 1. Additionally, this is supported by the facial expressions of Marjie's mother and the government official, respectively in panel 3 and 2, as well as the body language of Marjie's mother in panel 3. So to start off with panel 2, we can see that the government official's facial expression is basically apathetic, which adds on to the already apathetic ideology that the government has. And so this facial expression is a technique that is specific to graphic novels, and it's used to heighten the meaning or heighten the understanding of the reader so that they are able to further analyze what exactly the government is thinking in this panel and how that affects citizens, which is explored in panel 3, where we see Marjie's mother, who has the body language of someone who's surprised, as she has her hands on her face, and she's in her text as well, she is completely surprised by the implementation of the true path of Islam policy, as she mentions that it's a backward policy, kind of implying that the issue is making it so that the culture is regressing, which is ironic because the government thinks that the current culture is regressing, hence the word decadent. But in reality, Marjie's mother thinks that it's a complete decline in efficiency, which she also reinforces through the use of the hyperbole, saying that her husband would have to trade his car for a camel because a camel was used in early Islamic society, so it kind of adds on to why the ideology of the true path of Islam is something that only the government supports and not the citizens. And this shows how the global issue of oppressive regimes causing negative effects on people's freedom is explored in Persepolis, as Marjie's mother's freedom is being heavily restricted by the government's implementation of the true path of Islam policy. And finally, we have panel 4, where we can see the allusion to Marie Curie, a famous female chemist, and Margie mentions that she would never be able to be like Marie Curie because of the restrictions that the Iranian government has placed onto her. And so this kind of juxtaposes the two worlds that Margie and Marie Curie lived in, as Marie Curie was able to pursue her passions while Margie was restricted by the Iranian government and not able to pursue her passions, and more so forced to wear a veil and follow the path of a woman that the true path of Islam has forced onto her. So overall, Persepolis as a whole, as a literary work, is a perfect example of how oppressive regimes cause negative effects on people's freedom, as we see not only Margie, but also her mother and her father being negatively affected by the government by the government's policies. And this makes it evident that government having negative effects is a global issue, as it affects people of all races, genders, and statuses. So moving on, I'd like to analyze the Post. The Post, for context, takes place in the early 1970s as well, so around the same time as Persepolis, and the plot mainly revolves around the Pentagon Papers and the Washington Post's decision to publish it. However, their decision being ultimately rejected by the government due to the secrets that the Pentagon Papers hold and the government's reputation being at risk. And so the entire film kind of focuses on the idea that the government is not granting the Washington Post the freedom to press, and that shows and that highlights the global issue of oppressive regimes causing negative effects on people's freedom. So in this first panel, which is the panel on the right, this takes place during a ballroom scene, which is in the middle of the movie after Ben has obtained the Pentagon Papers but has not yet published it. And this serves as the main scene that happens right before the climax of the movie, where they do eventually publish the papers. So Ben in this scene, Ben being the executive producer of the Washington Post, and Kate Graham in the left panel being the actual owner of the company, he comes to Kate with the Pentagon Papers and the idea to publish it. However, Kate is not completely in agreement with that, and we can see that through Ben's own cognitive dissonance, where he doesn't have the eye contact with Kate Graham. And additionally, this scene takes place while during Kate Graham's party, while there are government officials outside of the very room they're inside in, and this adds pressure to both of them, because if a government official were to walk in, or if someone were to listen, then their entire purpose of trying to publish these papers for over several months would be ruined. And this shows how the anxiety that they're feeling is yet another negative effect that the government oppression is causing them. Additionally, the light source in the right panel is a lot less evident compared to the light source in panel 2, and this kind of shows how the eye contact in the scene is gradually increasing, showing that Kate and Ben are coming into more agreement in trying to publish these papers, which is again evident by the bigger light source and the eye contact that they're making. And additionally, in the left panel, we have Ben looking through a curtain while looking back at the government officials, and this kind of shows how there's a separation between the world that Ben and Kate live in versus the world that the government officials live in. And this idea that the government officials are kind of living in their own paradise is further explored in the text that's taken from during the scene. And so in this text, in lines 3 to 8, Ben mentions that the politicians and the press, they trusted each other, so they could go to the same dinner party and drink cocktails and tell jokes while there was a war raging in Vietnam. So he brings up this idea that government officials and the press themselves have both made this mistake, that they're able to live their leisurely lives while there are innocent lives being lost in Vietnam. And so this again shows how the idea that the government is not allowing the Washington Post to publish the papers is causing people in Vietnam to die, while people and the government officials are living their leisurely lives. And this idea that the authority figures kind of control the whole aspects of freedom, of the people's freedom, is again another showing of how the government and the citizens are not in complete agreement with what their rights should be. So to explore the Post as a body of work as a whole, this scene differs from other scenes, as during the film, Kate does develop several relationships with government officials that aren't really necessarily bad by any means. She does have several benefits, such as getting government connections from these people. However, as a whole body of work, the Post does mainly focus on Kate and Ben's battle against government officials. So in conclusion, Persepolis and The Post show through their textual and visual techniques that the global issue of oppressive regimes causing negative effects on freedom is apparent in both American society and Iranian society, emphasizing the idea that this issue is global. And to further explore how it is still prominent today, we can look at a tweet by Trump during 2017, where he mentions that the media are, quote-unquote, some of the worst people in the world, which is ironic in that the media is basically Trump's main source of information to get his opinions to the people. And this shows how the government relationship with the public is still in question today. And additionally, to go back to Middle Eastern society, when my mother was living in India, she experienced prejudice for wearing a hijab in India, as India is a majority Hindu country, and so the government there does not support Muslims fully after the war with Bangladesh and Pakistan, where they split countries. But once my mother moved to Canada, she no longer experienced that prejudice and was granted the freedom. And this shows how governments today could still improve upon themselves and grant freedom to citizens, and thus not have negative effects through their oppression. And this kind of shows how this global issue is still prominent today, and that this global issue can be further improved upon. So this is like 5 minutes for questions.
So, which of the author's choices is the most interesting in your opinion?
In my opinion, the choice in Persepolis to include the allusion to Marie Curie is probably the most important, as there are not that many references to American society or really any society other than Iran in the Persepolis. And this idea to bring this up now during like the height of the Iranian Revolution and government implementation of policies kind of shows how there was a different path that the Iranian government could have taken to improve upon themselves and not restrict the freedom of the people. And the idea that Margie is not given the same freedom as Marie Curie also heightens the idea that there was a better life for her that could have came about if the government did not oppress her freedom.
I guess staying in the Persepolis panel, how might the author want the audience to feel about a character or an event that happened?
I think, like, especially through the use of facial techniques, the author wanted us to feel kind of resentful towards the government official, as the government official is clearly not on the side of the people. And this book was a memoir about the experiences that she had, and obviously she wanted us to feel a certain way about how people's freedom in Iran was being suppressed. And so through the use of the facial technique, she wants us to feel resentful towards the government official in order to further her point about freedom being restricted in Iran.
So you mentioned that Persepolis and The Post take place around the same time. So how does that time period affect your interpretation of the issue?
So during the early 1970s, the Vietnam War was coming to a conclusion. So in terms of The Post, that would definitely show how there was high tension in America during that time. And so the need to publish the Pentagon Papers was obviously at an all-time high during the 1970s. And in addition, the Persepolis in the early 1970s as well, it was the height of the Iranian Revolution, and the government was implementing policies that would forever change the future of Iran. And so both the governments in these time periods were kind of implementing policies that would restrict people's freedom, and which was ironic during a time of revolution. While the Vietnam War time was not exactly a revolution, the country was still going about great changes because of the mistakes they made there. And this, in Persepolis, they did not realize exactly that they made a mistake just yet, but later on they would realize that this probably was not the greatest moves of the government. And so both these time periods, this time period allows both texts to explore effectively and bring it to context what exactly the government does in order to restrict the freedom of the people.
So you
We
mentioned,
should all be doing like follow-up questions at this point.
so you mentioned how your mom experienced your global issue, did you say? So how much would you say that your global issue affects you in the present day?
So as a Muslim myself, I have experienced a lot of prejudice in terms of, like, especially in America, after 9/11 happened. And there was obviously times where my mom also experienced that, but coming back to me, I would say in school sometimes I'm also called that. But to look at it from a broader context, there are Muslims across the world who are had to experience prejudice because of events that they had no control over. And 9/11 was a government kind of operation, which was caused by the bad relations between the American government and the government that attacked. And so I believe that this issue is global, and it affects more than just me because of the idea that Muslims all across the world, including me, have been negatively affected by government actions.
We're at 15. So could you connect it to like the broader body of work?
So the posts and connection to broader body of work, especially these two scenes, is basically the joint between the build-up and the climax, because this scene takes place in between the two, and this scene is especially important because of that. And so I believe like this whole ballroom scene is essential to the body of work, and it is very important to recognize this.